In 1966, American patrols were vanishing in the Vietnamese jungle. Whole squads ambushed, their radios silent, bodies recovered days later, if at all. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, an invisible force that struck without warning and dissolved like smoke into the green wall of the rainforest. Then, a handful of Australians arrived, and everything changed. This is the story of how a small nation's elite soldiers rewrote the rules of jungle warfare, teaching the world's most powerful military how to fight a war it was losing. Not with more firepower, not with superior numbers, but with patience, silence, and a philosophy so radical it seemed impossible. They hunted the hunters, and in doing so, they changed warfare forever. To understand what happened, you must first understand the jungle itself. Vietnam's rainforests were not merely terrain. They were a living adversary. Triple canopy coverage reduced visibility to less than 20 meters, sometimes less than 5. The air was thick enough to taste 95% humidity, temperatures hovering around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Every breath was work. Every step was calculated. Leeches dropped from branches, attaching themselves before you felt them. Bamboo vipers coiled in the undergrowth, their venom potent enough to kill within hours. Wait a while. Vines grabbed at equipment and exposed skin with thorns like fishhooks. The jungle didn't just hide the enemy, it actively conspired against the intruder. Sound traveled strangely. A whisper could carry 50 meters through dense foliage. The snap of a twig echoed. But automatic weapons fire could be dampened to dull thuds within 100 meters, swallowed by the vegetation. Soldiers reported hearing gunfights, following the sound, only to find nothing but empty jungle. The enemy had already vanished. Water was everywhere but rarely drinkable. Streams ran brown with sediment and parasites. Rain fell in sheets that could reduce visibility to 0 in seconds, turning trails to rivers of mud, making movement treacherous and detection nearly impossible. And then there was the smell. Rotting vegetation, stagnant water, the sweet, sick odor of decay that permeated everything. But experienced soldiers learned to detect other scents within this olfactory chaos. The acrid bite of cordite from a recent firefight, the particular funk of unwashed bodies, the distinct aroma of cooking rice or fish sauce that could reveal an enemy camp. The jungle was a sensory overload that somehow produced sensory deprivation. Too much information and not enough. It was disorienting by design. American soldiers, raised in suburbs and farmlands, found themselves in an alien world where every advantage they'd trained for evaporated. Air support? Useless beneath the canopy. Radio communication? Unreliable in the dense foliage, often reduced to whispers to avoid detection. Superior firepower? You couldn't hit what you couldn't see. And the enemy, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars, they knew this jungle intimately. They'd lived in it for years. Some for decades. They moved through it like water through stone, leaving almost no trace. They could lie in ambush positions for days without moving, surviving on handfuls of rice and pure discipline. This was their home. And by 1966, they were winning. The American approach to Vietnam was, in many ways, an extension of their success in previous wars. Overwhelming force, technological superiority, search and destroy. Large infantry units, sometimes battalion strength, would sweep through areas of suspected enemy activity. They moved with firepower, machine guns, mortars, artillery on call, air support overhead. The theory was sound. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with superior firepower. But the enemy refused to cooperate. Intelligence would report Viet Cong presence in a village or valley. A company of American soldiers would move in, sometimes 200 men or more. They'd arrive with helicopters, their distinctive whoop 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 audible for kilometers. The VC would hear them coming from miles away. By the time American boots hit the ground, the enemy had already melted into the jungle. Tunnels, hidden trails, pre-positioned supplies. The Viet Cong had spent years preparing this terrain. They knew every rice paddy, every stream crossing, every cave system. The Americans would find empty camps, still warm cooking fires, occasionally a hasty ambush that would inflict casualties before the attackers disappeared. Search and destroy missions often found nothing to destroy. Or worse, they'd find it waiting for them. Ambushes became routine. A patrol would be moving along a trail, the only passable route through dense jungle, when the world would explode. Automatic weapons fire from 3 sides. Grenades. Then silence. The enemy would break contact before air support could arrive, before artillery could be called in, leaving casualties and confusion in their wake. American patrols moved loud. It was impossible not to. 200 men with full combat loads, radios, weapons, ammunition. They sounded like a freight train moving through the jungle. Equipment rattled. Men talked. The smell of American cigarettes and insect repellent preceded them. The VC didn't need scouts to track American movements. They could hear them coming from a kilometer away, and numbers, which should have been an advantage, became a liability. Large units needed regular resupply. They cut trails. They established patrol patterns. They became predictable. And in the jungle, predictability was fatal. By late 1965, frustration was mounting. American casualties were increasing. The body count, that grim metric of success, was rising on both sides. But the enemy seemed inexhaustible. For every VC fighter killed, 2 more seemed to appear. American officers studied maps and terrain, planned elaborate operations, only to watch them unravel in the dense vegetation. Intelligence was often wrong or outdated. Even when it was accurate, by the time forces could be positioned, the enemy had moved. Some units began adapting. Smaller patrols, quieter movement. But institutional inertia was powerful. The American military machine was designed for conventional warfare, tank battles in Europe, amphibious assaults in the Pacific. This shadowy, intimate jungle warfare defied doctrine. Then, word began spreading through the Allied command. The Australians were doing something different. And it was working. In June 1966, the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province, establishing a base at Nui Dat. They were followed shortly by specialized units from the Special Air Service Regiment, the Australian SAS. The numbers were modest by American standards. Where the United States was deploying hundreds of thousands of troops, Australia's commitment peaked at around 7,500. The SAS contingent was even smaller squadron strength, rotating through deployments. We're talking about handfuls of men at any given time. But these were not ordinary soldiers. The Australian SAS traced its lineage to the British Special Air Service of World War II. But they'd forged their own identity in the jungles of Malaya during the emergency of the 1950s. For 12 years, they'd fought communist insurgents in rainforest conditions remarkably similar to Vietnam. They'd learned lessons written in blood and patience. Lessons about jungle movement, about tracking, about the psychology of ambush warfare. Lessons the Americans were just beginning to encounter. The Malayan emergency had taught them that conventional tactics failed in the jungle, that noise was death, that patience was a weapon as potent as ammunition. That understanding the enemy's patterns mattered more than superior firepower. That 4 men who moved silently could achieve what 400 could not. When the SAS arrived at Nui Dat, American advisors were initially skeptical. These Australians carried different weapons, the L1, A1, self-loading rifle instead of the M16. They moved in smaller groups. They spoke in hushed tones, even in the relative safety of base camp, as if the jungle might be listening. They watched. They listened. They asked questions. An American captain, years later, would recall his first meeting with an SAS patrol leader. He wanted to know about patrol patterns, about enemy contact reports, about where ambushes had occurred, not about firepower or air support or artillery positions. He wanted to know the enemy's habits. It was like talking to a hunter instead of a soldier. The Australians observed American patrols. They noted the noise discipline, or lack thereof, the predictable patterns, the reliance on firepower over fieldcraft. They said little, but they saw everything. One SAS sergeant, in a letter home, wrote, "The Yanks are brave as hell and good soldiers, but they're fighting the jungle like it's an obstacle instead of learning to become part of it. You can't defeat the jungle. You have to become invisible in it." Within weeks of arrival, Australian patrols began operating in areas American units had struggled to control. They moved differently. 5-man teams later reduced to 4 in some operations, slipping into the jungle before dawn and not returning for days, sometimes weeks. They didn't announce their presence. No helicopters to insertion points when possible. They walked in, often at night, using the darkness as cover. They moved slowly, pausing frequently, listening to the jungle, learning its rhythms, and they began to achieve results that seemed impossible. The first confirmed contacts were striking. An SAS patrol would report enemy movement. No request for artillery. No air support called in. Just patient observation. Then a brief, violent ambush. Enemy casualties confirmed. The patrol would extract, leaving no trace they'd been there. American officers began paying attention. How were 5 Australians achieving contact rates that entire companies were struggling to match? How were they moving through areas the VC supposedly controlled? How were they surviving when American patrols of 40 or 50 men were being ambushed regularly? The answer lay not in superior weapons or better training, though the SAS training was exceptional. It lay in a completely different philosophy of warfare. Picture this scenario. It's late 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province. An American rifle company, 160 men, conducts a sweep operation based on intelligence, suggesting enemy presence in a specific valley. They insert by helicopter at dawn. By noon, they've found nothing but abandoned campsites. By late afternoon, they're ambushed near a stream crossing. 7 wounded, 2 killed. The enemy breaks contact within minutes, disappearing before artillery can respond. That same week, a 4-man SAS patrol inserts into the same general area. They move on foot, at night. They spend 3 days barely moving, observing trails, water sources, patterns of bird activity. On the 4th day, they identify an enemy supply route. They set an ambush. 6 enemy fighters eliminated. Documents captured, supply cache destroyed. The patrol extracts undetected. Same jungle, same enemy, radically different results. This pattern repeated throughout 1966 and into 1967. The Australian SAS, representing a fraction of a percent of Allied combat strength in Vietnam, was achieving a disproportionate percentage of confirmed enemy contacts and documented kills in their area of operations. The statistics were striking. By some estimates, SAS patrols in Phuoc Tuy province accounted for nearly 10% of all enemy contacts, despite being less than 1% of the Allied fighting force. Their kill-to-loss ratio exceeded 100-to-1 figures so dramatic that some American officers initially doubted their accuracy. But the results were verified. The enemy dead, the captured documents, the destroyed supplies, all confirmed. The SAS was doing something that seemed to violate the laws of jungle warfare as they were understood. So how did they do it? How did a small unit from a nation of 11 million people teach lessons to the military of a superpower? How did they not just survive but dominate in terrain where American forces were struggling? What did they understand about the jungle, about the enemy, about warfare itself that others had missed? The answer would reshape special operations doctrine not just for the rest of the Vietnam War, but for the next 5 decades. It would influence how the United States trained its Rangers, its Special Forces, its SEAL teams. It would inform operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Philippines, and countless classified missions around the world. Because the Australian SAS didn't just adapt to the jungle. They didn't merely learn to survive in it. They transformed themselves into something the enemy had never encountered. Predators who hunted with patience, moved with silence, and struck with precision. They became ghosts. And to understand how, we need to examine not their weapons or their tactics in isolation, but their entire philosophy of warfare. A philosophy built on 3 deceptively simple principles that most soldiers talked about but few truly practiced: silence, separation, surprise. These weren't just words. They were a way of thinking, of moving, of breathing. They were the difference between the hunter and the hunted, and they would change everything. The Australian base at Nui Dat was different from American installations. Smaller, quieter, more deliberately organized. The SAS compound within it was different, still a discrete area where men moved with purpose but without urgency, where conversations happened in low voices, where equipment was maintained with obsessive care. American soldiers who visited noticed the difference immediately. One Marine sergeant, rotating through for a briefing, later described it. It felt like a monastery or something. Everyone was calm but focused. No one was shouting. Weapons were immaculate, not just clean, but perfect. And these guys, they'd just watch. Sitting there, not saying much, just watching everything. It was kind of unnerving, actually. The SAS approach to integration was methodical. They didn't assume they knew better. They didn't arrive with arrogance. They arrived with questions. They studied American after-action reports. They interviewed survivors of ambushes. They examined enemy weapons and equipment captured by U.S. forces. They walked trails where ambushes had occurred, looking at sight lines, likely positions, escape routes. They talked with local Vietnamese, not just through interpreters, but learning key phrases themselves: market gossip, rumors about VC movements, which villages had been visited recently by strangers, intelligence that couldn't be gained through official channels. And they watched the jungle itself. SAS training emphasized something many soldiers overlooked. The jungle has patterns, weather patterns, animal behavior patterns, patterns in how vegetation grows, where water collects, how trails naturally form. Understanding these patterns was the foundation of everything else. A patrol commander named Terry O'Farrell, later to become one of the SAS's most decorated soldiers, spent his first week in country, barely leaving the perimeter. He watched the tree line at different times of day, noting how light changed, how animals moved at dawn versus dusk, how the wind shifted. His squadron mates thought he was crazy, But O'Farrell understood something crucial. You can't detect what's abnormal until you understand what's normal. The jungle was never silent, but its sounds had meaning. Monkeys alarmed when humans approached. Certain birds went quiet near standing water. The rustling of undergrowth had different qualities depending on what was moving through it. Wild pig versus human, careful movement versus careless. The SAS learned to read these signs like a language. But more than that, they learned to operate within them, to move in ways that didn't alarm the birds, to time their movements with natural sounds, rain, wind, through bamboo, distant thunder that would mask the subtle noises of human passage. This was beyond training. This was adaptation at a fundamental level. Silence, separation, surprise. Three principles that sound simple but demanded absolute discipline. Let's examine each one. Silence. Not just quiet. Not just noise discipline. True silence. The kind that requires you to be aware of every movement, every piece of equipment, every breath. SAS patrols prepared their equipment with fanatical attention to detail. Metal components were taped or wrapped to prevent clinks. Buttons replaced with Velcro where possible, then that Velcro worn in until it made no sound. Dog tags wrapped in black tape and worn on laces that couldn't rattle. Magazine pouches positioned so a soldier could access them without the rustle of fabric. Canteens only filled halfway to prevent sloshing. Boots were broken in for months before deployment, not just worn, but tested specifically for squeaking or heel noise. Some operators preferred worn boots over new ones because they knew every sound their boots would make. The L1A1 rifle they carried had its sling modified, its metal parts darkened with boot polish or tape. Every weapon was test-fired, and the operator learned its specific characteristics, which way it pulled, how much noise the action made, the exact moment of trigger break. But equipment was just the beginning. Movement itself had to be silent. The Australian SAS taught a specific style of patrol walking learned from Malaya. The lead scout, always the most experienced tracker, moved in a crouch, testing the ground with each step before committing weight. Toes first, rolling to the heel, feeling for twigs or dry leaves before putting pressure down. It was exhausting. A patrol might cover only 500 meters in an hour, sometimes less. But they moved like shadows, barely disturbing the vegetation. They communicated with hand signals elaborate, specific gestures that could convey complex tactical information without sound. Even breathing was controlled. Through the nose, shallow, quiet, no mouth breathing that could be heard from meters away. One SAS operator, in a classified debrief, described it this way: you become aware of every bodily function. You're conscious of your heartbeat, worried it's too loud. You hold in coughs until you think your lungs will burst. You don't shift weight without thinking about it first. After days in the jungle, you stop thinking of yourself as human. You're just another creature trying to survive. This level of noise discipline created an enormous advantage. VC listening posts, designed to detect American patrols from hundreds of meters away, failed to register SAS movements. Enemy soldiers would walk within meters of hidden Australian positions without detecting them. There are documented cases of SAS patrols allowing enemy fighters to pass by so close they could have touched them, remaining undetected, waiting for the right moment to initiate contact on their terms. Separation. The SAS operated in teams of 4 to 6 men. This wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated. 4 men could move silently. 40 could not. 6 men could disappear into dense jungle. 60 left a trail. Small numbers meant small logistics. A patrol could carry a week's supplies and remain self-sufficient. They didn't need resupply helicopters that announced their presence. They didn't need established patrol bases that became targets. But there was psychological brilliance to this as well. 4 men in the jungle develop an almost telepathic connection. They learn each other's movements, anticipate actions, communicate with glances. The intimacy of small unit operations creates a trust and efficiency impossible in larger formations. And tactically, separation created multiple advantages. A 4-man patrol was virtually invisible to aerial observation and difficult to detect on the ground. If compromised, 4 men could break contact more easily than a platoon. They could take routes impassable to larger units, narrow trails, steep terrain, dense bamboo stands. Most importantly, separation changed the enemy's calculus. The VC were accustomed to ambushing larger American patrols. They'd set up L-shaped ambushes designed to catch 40 or 50 men in a kill zone, using massed fire to inflict maximum casualties before breaking contact. But a 4-man patrol, if you saw them at all, they were already in ambush position. They weren't following trails. They weren't making noise. They appeared where they shouldn't be, when they shouldn't be there. This created a psychological effect the SAS deliberately cultivated. The enemy began to feel watched. Reports filtered through VC channels about ghost soldiers who appeared from nowhere. The jungle, which had been the VC's sanctuary, started to feel less secure. Surprise, the culmination of silence and separation. American doctrine emphasized firepower and maneuver. Make contact, fix the enemy in place, destroy with superior firepower. The problem was the make contact part in the jungle. First contact usually meant an ambush, and the ambushed party took casualties before they could respond. The SAS reversed this equation. They initiated contact on their terms from ambush positions at times and places of their choosing. The enemy rarely knew what hit them. An SAS ambush was choreographed with precision. Positions selected for overlapping fields of fire. Primary and secondary targets assigned. Escape routes identified. Every patrol member knew exactly when and where to fire, what to do after initial contact, how to break off and extract. The ambush itself lasted seconds. Overwhelming violence, then immediate withdrawal. By the time enemy reinforcements arrived, if they dared to the SAS patrol, was gone. Moving through jungle no one else could navigate at night, leaving no trail. One Viet Cong prisoner, captured by Australian forces, was asked about SAS patrols during interrogation. His response, through an interpreter, "We know the Americans are coming from kilometers away. We prepare and ambush them, or we run. But the other ones, the quiet ones, we don't know they are there until our men are dying. Then they disappear like they were never there. It makes men afraid to move at night, afraid of the jungle itself." That was the goal. Not just to kill the enemy, but to make them afraid, to turn their sanctuary into a hunting ground, to become the threat they feared most. But silence, separation, and surprise were just the framework. The real art, the skill that separated good soldiers from exceptional ones, was tracking. In the Malayan jungle, SAS trackers had learned to follow communist insurgents through terrain where most people couldn't see a trail. They'd refined these skills over years, developing an almost supernatural ability to read the forest floor. Vietnam tested these skills further. The VC were experts at anti-tracking measures. They wore sandals made from old tires that left minimal impressions. They walked backward to confuse their direction of travel. They stepped on logs and stones to avoid leaving prints. They traveled during rain to wash away signs. But skilled trackers could still find them. A compressed leaf in the undergrowth barely visible, but its cellular structure damaged, making it slightly darker than surrounding leaves. That meant someone stepped there, and from the degree of damage, you could estimate when fresh compressions were darker, more pronounced. Older ones faded, dried out. A disturbed spiderweb at face height across a trail. Spiders rebuild webs overnight. If the web is broken, someone passed through since before dawn. If it's intact, the trail hasn't been used recently. Broken moss on a log. Moss bruises in a specific way when stepped on. The discoloration patterns could indicate whether someone stepped directly on it or just brushed against it. The former suggests moving forward normally. The latter suggests moving backward to confuse trackers. Ants. Disturbed ants swarm and take time to settle. An ant trail crossing a footpath would show disruption if crossed recently. Some SAS trackers could estimate how long ago ants had been disturbed by observing their behavior patterns. Scent trails. The human nose is remarkably sensitive when trained. The smell of sweat, cigarettes, fish sauce, unwashed clothing all carried on the breeze and could be detected meters away. Cooking fires left lingering odors hours after extinguishing. Even the distinctive smell of certain jungle plants when crushed could indicate recent passage. Water. Muddy water in a stream that should be clear meant someone crossed upstream recently within hours, depending on flow rate. Displaced rocks, underwater, sediment patterns, even the behavior of small fish could indicate a crossing point. The lead scout on an SAS patrol carried this knowledge, but it wasn't enough to simply see signs. You had to interpret them. A single footprint meant little, but the pattern of footprints told a story. Depth of impression indicated weight. A soldier carrying full equipment pressed deeper than someone traveling light. Stride length revealed speed. Was this a routine patrol or someone fleeing? Toe angle showed confidence, walking straight versus cautiously probing. Finding multiple tracks told you about unit size. Spacing between tracks suggested discipline level. Where tracks converged indicated rest stops or meeting points. There's a documented case from late 1966. An SAS patrol led by a tracker named Kevin Johnson spent 4 days following a VC supply route through the long high hills. They never saw the enemy directly. But Johnson read the jungle like a book. A trail used recently showed scuff marks on exposed roots. The direction of scuffing dirt pushed uphill or down indicated direction of travel. Knowing which direction supplies were moving suggested the location of a base camp. A rest stop showed impressions in leaf litter where packs had been set down. Johnson examined the patterns and estimated 6 to 8 individuals, judging by the number of distinct pack marks and cigarette butts. Near a stream, partially obscured tracks showed sandal prints, but one had a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel. Johnson memorized it. 2 days later, finding that same print confirmed they were still following the right group. On the 4th day, the patrol smelled cooking rice, a particular sweet smell when steamed over wood fire. They moved toward it, using terrain and wind direction, until they located the base camp. Rather than engage immediately, they observed for 6 hours, documenting the site, counting personnel, noting weapons. Then they called in artillery and withdrew. The camp was destroyed with minimal risk to the patrol. That was tracking at the highest level. Not just finding the enemy, but understanding their patterns well enough to predict behavior, locate infrastructure, and engage with overwhelming advantage. American units began requesting SAS assistance for tracking training. The Australian trackers were generous with their knowledge, but it quickly became apparent that this wasn't just a teachable skill. It was a mindset developed over years, even decades. You had to care about details most people ignored. You had to develop patience beyond what normal military training instilled. You had to think like your quarry, to understand not just where they went, but why. But perhaps the most revolutionary tactic the SAS employed was what some called hunting backwards, a complete inversion of standard operating procedure. Conventional wisdom said, get intelligence about enemy locations, move forces to those locations, engage. The problem was that intelligence was often outdated by hours or days. By the time forces arrived, the enemy had moved. The SAS flipped this entirely. Instead of searching for the enemy where intelligence suggested he might be, they looked for evidence of where he had been, and then they tracked him to where he was. They started with known facts: an ambush site where Americans were hit, a village raided for supplies, a trail where booby traps were found. These were fixed points in time and space, confirmed enemy activity. From these points, SAS trackers would work backward, not forward along likely routes of retreat, but backward along the routes the enemy must have used to arrive. This required a different kind of tactical thinking. Instead of asking, where did they go? They asked, where did they come from? And more importantly, where are they coming from consistently? Because here was the crucial insight. Ambushes might be random, but supply lines weren't. Base camps had to be accessible to supply routes. Rest areas had to be positioned along commonly used trails. The enemy needed water sources, food supplies, routes for moving wounded. If you found where an ambush happened, you could track backward to where the ambush team staged. From there, you could find their rest area. From there, their base camp or supply cache. One documented operation demonstrates this perfectly. In March 1967, an American patrol was ambushed near the village of Bin Ba. 2 killed, 4 wounded. The enemy broke contact quickly, disappearing into dense jungle. American forces swept the area, but found nothing. An SAS patrol, led by a sergeant named Ray Simpson, requested permission to investigate. They inserted 3 days after the ambush. Deliberately, they didn't want to track the specific enemy unit. They wanted to find the pattern. Simpson's team moved to the ambush site. They studied it not as a battleground, but as a workplace. Where had the ambushers positioned themselves? Which routes provided best sight lines to the kill zone? Where were positions set up for rapid withdrawal? They found a trail the VC had used, not obvious, but marked by subtle signs. Broken vegetation at waist height suggested someone carrying equipment. Compressed earth showed weight distribution consistent with several men. They followed it backward. Not quickly. They moved at a crawl, sometimes covering only a few hundred meters per day. They weren't tracking individuals. They were tracking the logic of enemy operations. The trail led to a rest area, a natural clearing with good drainage and nearby water. Signs indicated it had been used multiple times. The undergrowth worn down. Certain areas where equipment had been repeatedly set down, showing compression patterns. From there, another trail, more established this time. This wasn't a one-time route. This was infrastructure. Simpson's patrol followed it, taking their time. For 3 more days. The trail intersected with another trail, then another. This was a network, a highway system hidden in the jungle. Eventually, they found it. A base camp supporting 30 to 40 fighters. Bunkers. Supply caches. A small medical facility. Weapon maintenance area. This wasn't a temporary position. This was permanent infrastructure. Instead of engaging, Simpson's patrol observed for 18 hours. They documented everything. How many fighters? What weapons? Where sentries were posted? Daily routines. They identified the camp commander by behavior patterns. Then they withdrew undetected and called in a coordinated strike artillery, followed by an infantry sweep, with helicopter support on standby. The camp was destroyed. More than 20 enemy fighters killed or captured. Significant supplies and weapons confiscated. That's hunting backwards, starting from what you know the ambush site and working backward through the logical chain of enemy operations until you find something valuable. Not the needles in the haystack, but the haystack itself. American long-range reconnaissance patrols began adopting this technique. It required patience most units didn't have, but the results spoke for themselves. You didn't waste time chasing ghosts. You found the infrastructure supporting those ghosts and destroyed it. But the SAS's most effective weapon wasn't bullets. It was fear. Every tactical choice, the silence, the small numbers, the unpredictable timing of ambushes, created psychological effects on the enemy that were force multipliers far beyond the actual casualties inflicted. The Viet Cong and NVA regulars were experienced fighters. They'd been at war for decades. They weren't easily intimidated. But the SAS created conditions that undermined confidence at a fundamental level. First, there was the uncertainty. American patrols were predictable. They moved during the day. They used established trails. They made noise. You could prepare for them, ambush them, or avoid them. You understood how they operated. The SAS? They appeared at night. They used no trails or created false ones. They set ambushes where no one should be. A supply column moving along a route used safely for months would suddenly be hit. Then the attackers would vanish. The next night, a rest area 15 kilometers away would be ambushed. No pattern, no predictability. This created paranoia. Where were they? How many? How did they move through terrain so quickly? VC units began arguing among themselves. Sentries became jumpier, firing at shadows, wasting ammunition, and revealing positions. Second, there was the silence itself. Being attacked by an enemy you heard coming was one thing terrifying, but comprehensible. Being attacked by an enemy you never heard, never saw, until muzzle flashes erupted from the darkness, that violated the fundamental contract of jungle warfare. One captured VC fighter, during interrogation, described an SAS ambush on his unit. We were moving at night, slowly, carefully. Our point man was experienced. He knew the jungle. Then there was shooting, so much shooting, so fast, and the point man and the 2 men behind him fell. We fired back, but there was nothing to shoot at. Just jungle. Just darkness. Then nothing. Silence. We stayed frozen for an hour. When we finally moved to check our dead, they were gone. The quiet soldiers had taken their weapons, their equipment. They left the bodies but took everything else, like ghosts collecting trophies. This wasn't cruelty. It was calculated psychological operations. Taking equipment and weapons served practical purposes, intelligence, denying resources to the enemy. But it also sent a message. We can take what we want. We own this jungle. You are not safe here. Third, the SAS deliberately cultivated their reputation, not through propaganda, through action. When they ambushed a supply convoy, they didn't just inflict casualties. They destroyed supplies so thoroughly that they couldn't be salvaged. Medical supplies contaminated. Food stores burned or poisoned. Ammunition dumps detonated. The message? Supporting your fighters is impossible. We control supply lines. When they located a base camp, sometimes they didn't call in immediate strikes. They'd observe, Document, then raid at a time designed for maximum psychological impact during stand-down periods, or during celebrations, or when guards were rotating. The timing said, "We know your routines better than you do. There is no safe time." Fourth, and most importantly, they were patient. Operationally, tactically, strategically patient, in ways that created compounding psychological effects. An American soldier might spend 3 days in the jungle on patrol, uncomfortable, but endurable. Then, extraction, hot food, showers, mail from home, rest. An SAS patrol would spend 2 weeks in the jungle, sometimes 3, rotating watch in 2-man shifts, sleeping fitfully in hide positions, eating cold rations, never washing, barely moving, watching, waiting. This patience meant they could observe enemy patterns over time. They learned schedules, routines, vulnerabilities. And when they struck, it was after so much observation that the attack seemed omniscient. The cumulative effect was devastating to enemy morale. VC couriers started refusing to travel certain routes alone. Base camps had to be moved more frequently, disrupting operations and lowering morale. Supply lines became unreliable. Injured fighters went untreated because medical facilities were being discovered and destroyed. Local villages, seeing VC control challenged, became less cooperative, providing less intelligence and fewer resources. Intelligence reports from captured documents and prisoner interrogations began showing a pattern. VC units operating in areas with heavy SAS presence were suffering morale problems, desertion issues, and difficulty recruiting local support. One classified report, dated August 1967, summarized prisoner statements. Enemy fighters describe Australian Special Operations units as Nuoima ghost men. There is increasing reluctance to operate in areas where these units are known to be active. Prisoners report that fighter replacements sent to these areas often desert within weeks. This was warfare at its most effective. Not just killing enemy combatants, but making the enemy afraid to fight, making the jungle their greatest advantage feel like a liability, turning their own expertise against them through superior fieldcraft and relentless psychological pressure. The Americans took notice, and they wanted to learn. By mid-1967, it was clear that Australian tactics were achieving results beyond their numerical strength. American commanders wanted their soldiers to learn these methods. The challenge was, could you teach this? The SAS philosophy wasn't just a set of techniques. It was a fundamental reimagining of how small units operated. It required not just skills, but mindset shifts that contradicted years of conventional training. But attempts began. The U.S. Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol (LRRP) program already existed, but it was being reformed. These were American units specifically designed for deep penetration patrols in enemy territory. Small teams, usually 6 to 8 men, operating independently for extended periods. American LRRP units began training alongside Australian SAS patrols. Not classroom training, field training. Joint operations where American patrols would observe Australian methods directly. One LRRP team leader, Lieutenant Gary Linderer, later wrote about his experience. "We thought we were pretty good. We'd been running patrols for months, but watching the Australians was humbling. The difference wasn't physical. We were all fit, capable soldiers. The difference was discipline and patience. They did everything slower, quieter, more deliberately. Things we'd rush through in 5 minutes, they'd take 20. And when we asked why, the answer was always the same. Because it works. Because we survive." The Australians were generous with their knowledge, but they were also exacting instructors. They didn't accept shortcuts or approximations. An American soldier might think his noise discipline was adequate, certainly better than standard infantry. An SAS instructor would point out the metallic clink of a magazine being seated, the subtle brush of vegetation against a pack strap, the heel-first step that pushed a pebble against another. Good enough to not get yourself killed on your first patrol, one SAS sergeant told an American class. But not good enough to hunt someone who's been doing this for 20 years. And that's who you're facing. The training focused on principles first, techniques second, patience. American military culture emphasized speed, aggression, taking initiative. These were valuable qualities in conventional warfare. In the jungle, they got you killed. The Australians taught waiting, watching, letting the enemy reveal patterns before acting. It was psychologically difficult for soldiers trained to close with and destroy the enemy, to instead hide and observe. But those who learned it discovered its power. You could strike from perfect ambush positions. You could choose engagement timing. You could gather intelligence that made every subsequent operation more effective. Noise discipline. This went beyond be quiet. It was about eliminating every source of sound before entering the field. American units started adopting SAS equipment preparation rituals. Tape on metal. Weapons test-fired repeatedly to learn their specific characteristics. Boots modified. Equipment reduced to absolute necessities. More importantly, patrol members learned to move as a single organism. The point man set the pace, often maddeningly slow. Everyone matched his rhythm exactly. No independent movement. No adjusting equipment without signaling first. The entire patrol became one quiet shadow. Observation skills. The SAS emphasized reading the jungle, not just looking for the enemy, but understanding the environment so completely that the enemy's presence became obvious by disruption of natural patterns. Americans learned to identify bird calls that indicated alarm, to smell differences in the air that suggested human presence, to read track patterns and aging, to use all senses, not just vision. This required practice measured in months, even years. But even basic observation skills dramatically improved patrol effectiveness. MAC-V-SOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, a classified program running cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia, also learned from Australian methods. SOG teams were already elite, composed of Special Forces soldiers running incredibly dangerous missions in denied territory. But they adapted SAS techniques for their specific needs. Smaller team sizes. More emphasis on stealth over firepower. Longer observation periods before engagement. The Australian influence was clear in their evolving tactics. The knowledge transfer wasn't just tactical, it was cultural. American soldiers learned that effectiveness in jungle warfare wasn't about physical dominance or technological superiority. It was about becoming part of the environment. About respecting the jungle as both enemy and ally. About patience as a form of courage. This was humbling for some. The United States was the world's most powerful military. To learn from a smaller ally, that success required less of what America did well. Firepower, rapid response, technological advantage, and more of what the enemy did well. Patience, silence, intimate terrain knowledge, challenged, fundamental assumptions. But those who internalized the lessons became the next generation of American Special Operations doctrine writers. They took Australian principles back to training commands, to Ranger battalions, to Special Forces groups, to SEAL teams. One American officer, in a letter to his Australian counterpart, wrote, "You've taught us that sometimes the most aggressive action is to wait. The most powerful weapon is to be undetected. The greatest force multiplier is the enemy's uncertainty. These seem like paradoxes until you see them work. Then They seem like truth. The Australian influence on American tactics in Vietnam became so significant that by 1969 you could see clear doctrinal shifts, smaller patrols, greater emphasis on stealth, longer independent operations. These weren't officially credited to Australian teaching. Military bureaucracies rarely acknowledge where innovations come from, but the lineage was unmistakable. The principles were one thing. Seeing them executed at the highest level was another. Let's examine some documented operations that showcase the SAS approach. Operation Portsea, February 1967. A four-man patrol, call sign 2 Troop, was inserted 10 kilometers northwest of Nui Dat, based on intelligence suggesting enemy supply route activity in the area. The patrol moved slowly into position over 2 days, establishing a hide overlooking a trail junction. They observed for 72 hours without initiating contact. During observation, they documented 37 enemy fighters moving in small groups, all traveling south. They noted weapon types, equipment loads, time of day for movement. They identified a pattern. Most movement occurred between 0400 and 0700 hours, using darkness and morning mist as cover. On the third day, instead of ambushing, the patrol leader made a tactical decision: follow the trail backward. Where were these fighters coming from? This was hunting backwards in practice. Moving cautiously, staying off the trail itself, the patrol tracked north for another 2 days. They located what they were looking for: a battalion-sized base camp with permanent structures, supply dumps, a small hospital. The patrol observed the camp for another 18 hours, documenting layout, defensive positions, sentry patterns, daily routines. They noted a large ammunition storage bunker with inadequate security, a high-value target. Then they withdrew. 8 days in the field, living on cold rations, in constant danger, never firing a shot. But the intelligence they gathered was priceless. A week later, based on their reconnaissance, a coordinated strike destroyed the base camp. Artillery saturation, followed by infantry assault. The ammunition bunker detonated, triggering secondary explosions that rendered the entire camp unusable. Intelligence estimates suggested more than 60 enemy casualties and significant equipment destruction. The SAS patrol that made it possible had initiated no contact themselves. They'd simply observed, documented, and reported. Their patience achieved more than a dozen conventional combat operations. Operation Knocker, August 1967. An SAS patrol led by Sergeant Bob McFarlane was tasked with investigating reports of enemy activity near the village of Suai. The patrol inserted at night, a technique American forces rarely used. Using darkness for cover, they moved 3 kilometers to a position overlooking known trails. For 5 days, they observed minimal enemy activity during the day, but at night, between 2,200 and 0200 hours, they detected consistent movement. Small groups, moving with discipline, using the darkness confidently. McFarlane realized they were observing a different kind of enemy force. Not local VC, but likely NVA regulars moving south. More professional, better equipped, more dangerous. On the 6th night, the patrol moved to a new position, a narrow point on the trail where the jungle canopy created a natural choke point, perfect ambush terrain. They set up in complete darkness, using touch and memorized layouts. No lights, no talking. Everything done through pre-practiced movements. They positioned themselves in an L-shaped ambush with overlapping fields of fire. Then they waited. 2 hours. 3. 4. At 0130 hours, they heard it. Quiet movement on the trail. The point man appeared an NVA soldier moving carefully, but not carefully enough. Behind him, more soldiers. At least a dozen, strung out along the trail in tactical formation. McFarlane waited until the maximum number of enemy fighters were in the kill zone. Then he initiated the ambush with a burst from his rifle. The other patrol members opened fire simultaneously. The ambush lasted 12 seconds. 9 enemy fighters confirmed killed. The patrol ceased fire, counted to 30, then withdrew immediately along their pre-planned escape route. They moved 500 meters, stopped, listened for 20 minutes. No pursuit. They'd extracted before enemy reinforcements arrived, before artillery could respond, before the ambushed unit even fully understood what had happened. By dawn, they were 3 kilometers away, observing from a hide position. They watched enemy forces arrive at the ambush site, an entire company, sweeping the area for the attackers. But the SAS patrol had left minimal trace. Spent casings policed, tracks disguised, withdrawn along rocky terrain that showed minimal sign. Operation Paddington, October 1967. Sometimes the SAS mission was reconnaissance, not combat. Operation Paddington demonstrated the value of pure intelligence gathering. A 6-man patrol was inserted near the Long Green mountain range to investigate suspected enemy logistics infrastructure. Intelligence suggested the area was used for supply caching and troop movement, but details were minimal. The patrol spent 11 days in the field. They moved in loops and patterns designed to reveal any established enemy trails or camps without following obvious routes that might be booby-trapped or observed. What they found was significant: an elaborate supply network, multiple caches hidden in cave systems, trail systems invisible from aerial observation but clear on the ground, rest areas positioned along the routes, a sophisticated logistics infrastructure supporting enemy operations across the entire region. The patrol documented everything: mapped coordinates, photographed cache locations, estimated supplies, identified probable traffic patterns. They never engaged. The enemy remaining undetected was more valuable than tactical contact. When they extracted, the intelligence package they delivered became the basis for a month-long campaign. Airstrikes destroyed cache locations. Artillery interdicted known trails. Infantry sweeps, guided by the SAS reconnaissance, captured substantial supplies and disrupted enemy logistics for months. 1 patrol, 11 days, no combat, but strategic impact far beyond their numbers. These operations weren't publicized at the time. No war correspondence followed SAS patrols. No dramatic film footage. But the results spoke to those who knew. Quietly, professionally, the SAS was achieving effects disproportionate to their size. And other special operations forces were paying attention. The lessons learned in Vietnam didn't stay in Vietnam. When the war ended in 1975, the Australian SAS returned home and began codifying their experiences. Lessons learned reports, training modifications, doctrinal updates. The institutional knowledge gained at such cost was preserved and refined. But the real legacy was in how those lessons spread globally and evolved to meet new conflicts. Australia, Timor-Leste, 1999. When violence erupted in East Timor following the independence referendum, Australian forces deployed rapidly. The SAS was at the forefront. The tactics were familiar to anyone who'd studied Vietnam operations. Small patrols, extended independent operations, intelligence gathering prioritized, patience over aggression. The jungle environment was different, less dense, different climate, but the principles translated perfectly. SAS patrols, located militia positions, documented movements, provided targeting data. For larger forces, They operated for weeks in isolated positions, maintaining surveillance, gathering intelligence that shaped the entire operation. One patrol spent 17 days observing a suspected militia supply route, documenting everything that moved along it. That intelligence allowed Australian forces to interdict supplies and isolate militia forces with surgical precision. Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. Afghanistan wasn't jungle. Mountain warfare requires different skills, but the underlying philosophy, small units, patience, intelligence gathering, precision over firepower, proved devastatingly effective. Australian SAS operators in Afghanistan ran long-range patrols in mountain terrain, operating at elevations and in weather conditions that challenged even the toughest soldiers. They'd spend weeks establishing observation posts, overlooking Taliban supply routes or safe houses. The patience learned in Vietnam jungles translated to Afghan mountains. Wait for the right moment. Gather intelligence. Strike with precision. Withdraw before overwhelming response. And crucially, they trained Afghan partners in the same methods. Not just tactical techniques, but the mindset, patience, observation, understanding patterns. Some of the most effective Afghan Special Operations units were those trained by Australian instructors who understood that raw aggression was less valuable than disciplined patience. United States. Evolution of SOCOM. The United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, founded in 1987, incorporated many lessons that trace directly to Vietnam-era observations of Australian tactics. U.S. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Special Forces groups all adopted variations of small unit patrol tactics, patience-based reconnaissance, and the philosophy of achieving strategic effects with minimal footprint. The emphasis on silence, on becoming part of the environment rather than dominating it. On intelligence gathering as primary mission, these weren't originally American doctrinal choices. They were learned, often painfully, by observing allies who'd mastered them decades earlier. SEAL team operations in Iraq during the 2003 to 2011 period show clear lineage. Small teams, infiltrating enemy territory, remaining undetected for extended periods, gathering intelligence, striking with precision. The desert environment was radically different from jungle, but the operational philosophy was identical to what the SAS had demonstrated in Vietnam. One SEAL commander, in a classified after-action report from 2007, wrote, "We're running operations that would look familiar to Australian SAS operators from the 1,960 seconds. Different technology, night vision, better communications, GPS, but the same fundamental approach. Small, quiet, patient, precise." The principle hasn't changed because it reflects truth about special operations. You can't outmuscle a determined enemy on his terrain. You have to outthink and outweight him. British SAS. Continuing evolution. The British SAS, from whom the Australians originally drew inspiration, also evolved. Their operations in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, in the Falklands, in Iraq and Afghanistan, all showed tactical evolution influenced by shared Commonwealth experiences. British and Australian SAS units trained together regularly, exchanged personnel, shared lessons learned. The cross-pollination of tactics and techniques created a special operations culture that emphasized similar values: patience, professionalism, precision, minimal footprint. Global Special Operations. By the 2000s, Special Operations Forces worldwide were adopting similar approaches: small unit tactics, extended independent operations, intelligence as primary mission with direct action as secondary. Patience over aggression. The Australian SAS hadn't invented these concepts. Many were as old as warfare itself, but they'd refined them, proven them in the most challenging environment, and demonstrated that they worked against a sophisticated enemy. Modern special operations doctrine, regardless of nation, shows this influence. The emphasis on small elite units, the investment in individual training over mass, the understanding that strategic effects don't require large numbers, sometimes the opposite. The phrase economy of force takes on new meaning when 4 soldiers can achieve what 400 cannot. But there was another side to this story, one that doesn't appear in tactical manuals or after-action reports. The men who conducted these operations paid a price that statistics cannot capture. Imagine spending 3 weeks in the jungle. You're never dry. Your feet are perpetually wrinkled, pale, infected with fungus. Leeches are constant companions. You stop removing them after the first few days, only clearing them away when they become large enough to cause problems. You eat cold rations, maybe 1,200 calories a day, when you're expending 3,000. You lose weight rapidly. Your body consumes itself. You don't sleep. Not really. 2-hour watches, rotating through the patrol. Even when you're off watch, you're aware of every sound, every movement. After a week, you're functioning on accumulated sleep deprivation that would be considered torture in any other context. You can't talk, can't make noise. Days pass in near total silence except for absolutely essential whispered communication. The isolation is profound. You're with your patrol mates, but you might as well be alone. Everyone retreats into their own head. And there's the fear, not panic. SAS training eliminates panic, but constant low-level awareness that death could come at any moment. Every sound might be enemy movement. Every bird alarm might mean you've been detected. You're in the enemy's territory, outnumbered hundreds to 1, with extraction often days away. One SAS veteran, decades after Vietnam, described it in an interview. People think courage is charging a machine gun nest. That's bravery, sure. But courage is also lying in a hide position for 72 hours with dysentery, with leeches in your ears, with your feet rotting in your boots, knowing that if you move wrong, if you make a sound, everyone in your patrol dies. And you still don't move. You still don't make a sound. That's a different kind of courage. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers returned from operations, hypervigilant, unable to relax, startled by normal sounds. Some reported that for years after Vietnam, they couldn't walk through wooded areas without automatically looking for tracks, assessing sight lines, identifying ambush positions. Relationships suffered. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it's like to spend weeks convinced you're about to die? How do you describe the intimacy of a 4-man patrol? Bonds formed in conditions most people can't imagine, that make civilian friendships feel shallow by comparison. And there was minimal recognition. The SAS operated classified missions. No media coverage. No dramatic photographs for the newspapers back home. Men would return from months in Vietnam, having conducted operations of strategic significance, and couldn't tell their families what they'd done. No parades. Few medals. The SAS culture discouraged overt recognition anyway. Just quiet professionals doing impossible work in impossible conditions, then returning to civilian life carrying memories they couldn't share. Some carried other burdens. The men they'd killed in ambushes. The faces seen through rifle sights in that brief moment, before pulling the trigger. The enemy weren't abstractions, they were individuals, often young, sometimes carrying photographs of families that would be found on bodies later. One SAS operator, in a private conversation recorded for an oral history project, said, "We were good at what we did. maybe the best. But being good at killing doesn't make it easier. I remember faces from ambushes 50 years ago. I see them sometimes when I'm falling asleep. We did what we had to do, what we were trained to do. But I'll carry those faces until I die. This is the cost of warfare at this level. Not just the physical danger, though that was ever present, but the psychological weight of sustained operations in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The isolation, the fear, the burden of taking lives, even in war, even when necessary. The men who conducted these operations didn't ask for special recognition. That wasn't the SAS way. But their sacrifice, and it was sacrifice, deserves acknowledgement. They changed how the world fights wars, and they paid for that knowledge with pieces of themselves they never got back. So what did the Australian SAS really change? On the surface, they changed tactics. They demonstrated that small units, properly trained and employed, could achieve strategic effects. They proved that patience could be more powerful than firepower. They showed that the best way to win in the jungle wasn't to dominate it, but to become part of it. These lessons influenced military doctrine across the world. Every special operations force today, regardless of nationality, employs principles that trace back, at least in part, to those Vietnamese jungles in the 1,960 seconds. But the deeper change was philosophical. The Australian SAS challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, about what made a soldier effective, about what created tactical advantage, about how to measure success. They demonstrated that bigger wasn't always better, that technology, while valuable, couldn't replace human skill and patience, that understanding your enemy's perspective was as important as understanding your own capabilities. They showed that warfare, at its most refined, becomes personal, not in an emotional sense, but in scale. Small groups of highly skilled individuals, operating with minimal support, achieving effects that entire divisions couldn't match. There's a memorial at Campbell Barracks in Western Australia. It lists the names of SAS soldiers who died in Vietnam. Not many names, the SAS casualty rate was remarkably low, a testament to their skills. But each name represents a person who went into the jungle and didn't come back. Next to those names, there's a simple inscription: "Who dares, wins." It's the SAS motto, borrowed from the British. But in the context of Vietnam, it takes on specific meaning. Daring, in the jungle, wasn't charging into danger. It was the courage to wait. The audacity to move so slowly and carefully that you became invisible. The boldness to trust in patience when every instinct screamed for action. The Viet Cong and NVA were formidable enemies. They'd fought for decades. They knew the jungle intimately. They were disciplined, motivated, and skilled. They defeated the French. They challenged the Americans. But the Australian SAS learned to beat them at their own game, not by being louder or more aggressive, but by being quieter, more patient, more attuned to the environment. They didn't change the jungle. The jungle remained the same, dangerous, disorienting, unforgiving. They changed themselves. They adapted to an environment that seemed impossible to dominate. And in doing so, they developed methods that would influence warfare for generations. Today, somewhere in the world, a small patrol is moving through difficult terrain, maybe jungle, maybe mountains, maybe desert. They're moving slowly, quietly, patiently. They're watching, learning patterns, waiting for the right moment. They might not know it, but they're practicing a philosophy refined in the Vietnamese jungle decades ago by soldiers from a small nation who proved that excellence doesn't require scale. That effectiveness comes from skill, discipline, and the courage to wait. The Australian SAS didn't just change jungle warfare. They changed how we think about special operations, about what's possible with the right training, the right mindset, the right approach. They proved that sometimes the most powerful force isn't the one that makes the most noise. It's the one you never hear coming. In memory of the men of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment who served in Vietnam, 1966 to 1971, Who Dares Wins.